Fighting out of Toronto, Canada, he is the bodybuilding champion of the world, presenting James Hurricane Hergott.
James Hergott here with the Hergott Show, and I am here to kind of do an autopsy on the Jordan B. Peterson interview that I conducted. I want to get some things out of the way just to start. First of all, Dr. Peterson was very sick when he did our interview, and I really appreciate his generosity in coming on the show and interacting with me and all that, especially not feeling his best. And you know, he's the type of guy that, you know, I'm not a channel with a huge subscription base. Now, I've done a lot of things in entertainment, but I think one of the reasons, and I can't speak for Dr. Peterson, but I believe one of the reasons that he wanted to do the interview was on a conceptual level. And it just kind of speaks to his character, because I've reached out to other people. Like, I've had people that I've known from other projects I've worked on, like Bruce Buffer and things like that, that have come on and done my show. But there's a lot of people that I approach to do my show, and you know, most of the time they turn you down, and sometimes not in the nicest way. So you know, Dr. Peterson was very generous in the first place, and even coming on to do my show, and I appreciate that. Not to mention not being well and being exhausted from all his travels and interviews and so forth. The interesting thing about this interview is that I had a plan, a strategy going in, essentially to build a case for certain conclusions that I wanted to, that I believed. And I didn't know exactly how Dr. Peterson would react to my questions. So, but I had maybe an idea based on watching a lot of his videos and stuff, kind of the types of answers he would give and what his philosophical and beliefs would be. However, his answers were even more in line with what the case I was trying to build, and actually more honest and more stark than I would have expected. And I think that the conclusions that are drawn from this are truly horrific. There's not really any way around it. I mean, I was kind of, for days since I did that interview, I've pondered the answers that were given, and I'm going to intercut some of his answers with, you know, my comment on them. But they're very blunt answers, which, when you really consider what he's saying, it's a serious thing. And I'm going to title this video "The Fight for Civilization," which sounds overly dramatic, but I don't think it is. And I think as I build the case to you about, first of all, what I was trying to do in the interview, and also the conclusions that I've drawn from his responses, I think you'll see that it's pretty hard to argue that it's anything but a fight for civilization. You know, I've done a lot of different entertainment things in my past that I'm proud of. I executive produced and wrote a movie, a documentary about George St. Pierre, who at the time was the Canadian Athlete of the Year 3 years in a row. Prior to that, just a few months before that, I went to Iraq and I did a fight for the troops, and it was an active war zone at the time. I've had a movie in theaters. I was president of a Beverly Hills entertainment company that was publicly traded. I was involved in Generation Iron, and in fact, when Generation Iron premiered both in LA and New York, I was the guy standing at, on the stage introducing the movie for the first time to all the bodybuilders that were in it and all the fitness people within the community that were packed in to see this movie. I could go on the list, but this is not about me. But my point is that I did all of those things, and I feel that this one interview with Dr. Peterson to be the most important thing I've ever done from an entertainment point of view, or anything outside of a personal point of view, because of what it speaks to on a social level and the impact that it really has. So because of that, I felt it necessary to really kind of break down what was said, because even myself, like, I've listened to the interview a couple of times, and there's things that you miss within that interview for me upon the first listen. That the second time, the more that I listen to it, frankly, the more horrifying the conclusions that I come to as a result of it. And it's truly haunting. So from a social point of view, in terms of its actual relevance to our life right now, I think it's very important. So if you haven't seen the interview, watch the interview. This is a companion piece to be watched after that. There's a couple of other interviews that I want to draw your attention to that I did that have kind of flown under the radar. One of them's had, 6,000 views, so it went slightly viral, and that was with Brian Ludmer, who's a attorney who specializes in shared parenting, and we talked a lot about the court system, and he headed up a bill on getting shared parenting within Canada, and he's an expert in that. And I also did an interview with the chairman of CAFE, which is the Canadian Equal Rights organization, and we got into the war on masculinity. So I'm going to link those two interviews below and put them at the end of this interview. And I really think that they're companion pieces, because some of the questions that I asked Dr. Peterson were derived from those interviews, and I think that there's certain topics within things we talk about that I get deeper into in those interviews that are worth checking out. So let me kind of build the case for you and why I do think this is, really a fight for civilization. So I'll start with some of the conclusions that are drawn, and then I'll get into breaking down those individual conclusions and what was said by Dr. Peterson and what I think, this means. And then hopefully at the end of this, I'm going to try and present some answers as well, so that it's not left in just like a hopeless manner. So the first thing was that people are forming less meaningful relationships, and as a result, we're basically having a more isolated people that have more mental disorders. And I believe that one of the reasons that we have trouble forming these relationships is the result of media. I mean, we've had 100 years of media programming, everything from the Disney films that show, people happily ever after, to, shows where the movies are just endlessly, people meet the perfect person and relationships work great. And then you've also got government influence in terms of their social experiments and things like that, changes to what marriage is, the erosion of religion and its influence in our culture. All of these things have really kind of formed a perfect storm where we're having less and less meaningful relationships. There's an increase in fatherlessness. There's issues with the court system. There's also the state is taking over a huge amount of responsibility in terms of they're coming in and providing largely to single mothers welfare and other social assistance. And then the big problem with that is that it's been hugely underestimated what men contribute in terms of the development of the child. So, it's not just a paycheck, it's not just money that the child needs. In fact, I would argue it's more important what is provided to the child in terms of both the male and the female and the things that they bring to the table. And I'll get into that deeper. But, essentially just having the government come in and provide a check to single mothers is not solving that developmental problem. And I think that's been a huge mistake over the last 50 years, which is gonna play out in some really serious ways. And fatherlessness is a corrupting force that leads to a lot of social ills. And I'm going to actually quote a whole bunch of statistics to you. But bottom line is, if you're in the womb, the number one thing that you don't want to be if you were born into Western civilization is born into a fatherless home. Because your outlook is worse born into a fatherless home than being born into poverty or a different race or whatever your outcome is. So in terms of like the lottery of life, being born in a fatherless home is a poor starting point. And this is increasing. There's more single parent homes than ever before. There's more, there's lowering birth rates. And I think that, when you see what the statistics are of what both men and females become if there's fathers absent, we've got a lot of things that we're going to see over the next few generations that are going to result from this. We see men being pushed out of the system by the court system. We see them opting out because essentially the court system is incredibly biased. There's not a shared parenting, even though we're supposed to have equality. There is no equality within our court system as of now, and in only 7% of the cases do men get sole custody. So there's absolutely no equality. However, there's all of the fatherlessness issues that I'm going to get into. So when it comes to that, we've got a big problem with that, with the court system across the West and its bias. And because men are opting out, we're having less and less marriages. Men are just basically saying, you know what, there's nothing in it for me in terms of marriage. There's no incentive for me to get married, to have children. And therefore, instead of fulfilling the typical roles of the past, what's happening is that men are playing video games, they're watching pornography, they're going MGTOW, they're basically saying, I'm going to be a player. There's a whole movement for, the pickup artist movement where men just pick up women, have sex with them, then, leave them. And we're seeing all of these things, by the way. It may seem, when I speak of this issue, that I'm speaking just about what bad happening to men. I'm speaking about what's bad happening to women as a result of this as equally. I mean, I have a daughter that's 2.5 years old, and she's going to be raised in this culture, and I have serious concerns about it. And one of the big things is that women say they can't find a good man. Well, one of the reasons they can't find a good man is because men are opting out. They're becoming more players. They're not wanting to settle down. They're not wanting to get into relationships. And then women are becoming more bitter and jaded as a result of that. And we're having more of a fight between the sexes, where basically we have a lot of people growing old and dying alone. This is a huge thing. We're not coming together. We're not forming long-term bonds. And if you don't form those long-term bonds, it's a corrupting force, which we'll get into that as well, which Dr. Peterson speaks of. So this issue where men are choosing not to participate in the system and having trouble in terms of wanting to be fathers and being pushed out by the legal system, it's turning men off of marriage. Women are participating more and more in university and in careers, but then by the time they come out of school and establish a career, their time frame for having children is truncated, and as a result of that, they're more desperate. And then there's a bunch of men who basically don't want to get married, and there's a huge problem of women trying to find men. And then there's also the problem of finding a good man, which we'll get into as well. And ultimately, the children are the ones that are hurt the most out of this, because more broken homes, and society is hurt as well, because essentially there's less of a population base of the native population. And by native, I mean, you know, Canadians or Americans or whoever the actual national base is. You're having, you know, the birth rates are declining and marriage is at its lowest point. So you're really not, you're having a complete breakdown of the nuclear family. You're not having children being born, and the ones that are being born are often being born into fatherless homes. So women are becoming more and more unhappy. I didn't really get into this with Dr. Peterson, but that's what the statistics are, that women in middle age on are more unhappy than any generation before. And I think if you look at just what's going on, that makes sense. I think they're having trouble finding a good guy. They're having trouble wrestling with career, and if they're a single mother, being a single mother, and finding a man, and all of these things. And I think feminism at the beginning did some really good things, and then I think that it went too far, and more importantly, it had, you know, it might have, the heart might have been in the right place, but the outcome has not been what was expected. And I think that we haven't dealt with the fact that there's a lot of unhappy women, and there's a lot of alone women, and men die at a younger age than women. So, like, for example, my aunt, who's she was in her 60s at the time, she went to go on this thing where you would meet other single people, and there was 120 women and 2 men on this single thing. One of that is because there's men die younger, and the other is for the reasons that we're talking about, of men opting out. So that's a huge problem, because as women get older, they may not anticipate this, especially if they're young and attractive and they have lots of options. They don't foresee that down the road, if they don't have a really satisfactory long-term relationship, they are going to end up alone. And a lot of people have problems even forming those long-term relationships because they've engaged in this very disposable society, and just, you know, dating different people and going from one to the other. To exacerbate that problem, you've got the issue of the high women wanting a man biologically who's either of equal status or higher status, and more women are graduating university now than men. Lots of women are entering the workforce, so for them to find a man who's equal or higher, it's increasingly difficult. And Dr. Peterson addresses this, you know, because I asked him about this, and he says, you know, very directly, well, what's going to happen is that there's going to be less and less of a pool of men to choose from that are high status, and those men are not going to have an incentive to get into a relationship or to get married, because they're going to have a ton of sexual options, because all the women are trying to get those few men, which, when you think about marriage and the breakdown of that you put those together, basically those high status men are going to just play the field. They're going to have, you know, this woman on this night, another woman on this night. Even if they're very well educated women, they're going to have a pick of the litter of all these great women and have no incentive to get married at all. And then you have the secondary problem, which is you have a huge amount of men who are not high status. And then what happens with those? And, you know, I asked Dr. Peterson about that. And first of all, when there's a huge, you know, a growing difference between the high status men and the, you know, low status men, one of the things that happens is that you have more abnormal behavior, because the average status or low status male is going to try and act out in order to stand out. So you're going to have more crime. You're going to have more radicalization. I think you're going to have more people that they just become more introverted and get into their video games and things like that. So you have a huge population of men filled with testosterone who are going to be unhappy, angry, and then you're going to have a small group of men who have the pick of the litter, and that's a real bad place to be. So I predict as that continues, more school shootings, more people entering radical groups, and it doesn't have to be Islamic radicals. It could be any radical group. It could be anything where somebody feels disenfranchised and they feel that, hey, I'm not getting the attention of these women, so I'm going to take higher risk taking because, you know, it's worth it to take more risk and to try and attain a certain, certain glory so I can get women rather than remain anonymous and disappear into nothingness. So you're going to see, I believe, more violence and more acting out of low status males, which it is a really bad thing, obviously. So as you have the breakdown of the nuclear family overall, which all of these things kind of lead into, then you have a systemic problem. You have a problem where you have children who grow up that don't have positive role models. They're not going to see couples that are together, that are doing well, that are successful, and they're not going to have a model to pattern themselves off of so that they can have successful relationships. Not to mention the fact that if they're in broken homes, they're going to have all kinds of psychological consequences of that. If fathers aren't in the picture, those psychological consequences. So we're having increased breakdown of the nuclear family, and I think this is a really bad thing. And it's going to lead to more people going into what Dr. Jordan Peterson would say, going into the underworld. So in other words, depression, negative, nihilistic outcome, or nihilistic outlooks of the world. So what's the summary of this? And I'll get into more details, but let's deal with the summary of this. Is children are left more broken, okay? Women are left unhappy and having trouble finding a good mate. And the ones that they would want to settle down with are not incentivized to settle down at all. They're going to end up with a life partner. And men are disenfranchised from participating if they're low status, and they're going to act out. And the high status ones are going to have no incentive to really get into a relationship. And those low status males are going to become increasingly radical. And we see that in many aspects of our society. So I'm going to get some more into the details in terms of kind of proving sort of my case in terms of this, and in many cases using Dr. Peterson's words, or at least his beliefs, and showing where this is headed. So the health of developing a long-term relationship and family is part of your character development. This is something that comes up very early in the interview. So in other words, having a relationship isn't just a long-term, real intimate relationship isn't just about growing old and being happy and having somebody that's there. Being forced to work out issues with somebody, essentially locking yourself in a closet and saying, we're going to work through this stuff and nobody's leaving until this is worked out, builds character, which is fundamental to our personal development, our personal happiness, as well as making a better society. So if there's no emphasis on those relationships, then we just have a bunch of disposable relationships. By having disposable relationships, we're never forced to do any real inward work. And that means less people with character in our society.
That helps generate an anxiety-ridden and meaningless life, because there's no continuing story for the medium to the long term. I think in our culture, increasingly, we act like we're 18 forever, and we don't understand that over the course of your life, you have to build something in order to remain satisfied with your existence. And part of that is building an intimate relationship with someone, partly because it's healthier to do that. Two brains are better than one, and interacting deeply with someone that you can't run away from, because that forces you to contend with them. That builds your character and builds their character too. And of course, that also provides the foundation for a family. And as you get older, your family becomes increasingly important to anchor you in life. I mean, by the time you're in your 50s, if you have children, as a general rule, they're the most important thing in your life. You know, they're starting to grow up at that point, but that seems to be the part of life that's genuine and real. And I think our culture acts very immaturely, because we do increasingly act as if people are disposable. I mean, the psychologist Carl Jung talked about the necessity for marriage as a psychological, from a psychological perspective. And he said, if you don't tie yourself to someone, then so that you can't run away, there's no reason for you to reveal yourself to them, and there's no reason to really solve the problems. Because as you pointed out, you can just jump to another person. And so then whenever the going gets rough, you don't have to make any changes. You don't have to think. You can just assume that there's a better person waiting for you out there somewhere. And the problem is that a great relationship, I mean, hopefully a relationship starts with a certain amount of honesty and willingness to communicate and some attraction. But a great relationship is built over time. It's not something that you discover and live happily ever after. It's a very shallow way of looking at it. And I do think that your best bet for finding a great relationship is to work on your own personal development and try to build yourself into the kind of character that could have a great relationship. And that would be someone who can speak honestly and who can listen, and who's reciprocal in their interactions, and is willing to solve problems and to commit over the long run. It's that sort of thing that transforms the potential of your life into accomplishment, and hopefully gives you the necessary sense of satisfaction and meaning that helps buttress you against life's finitude and suffering. There's almost nothing better than character development. And then you take that with you wherever you go. And a lot of that has to do with sorting out your priorities and deciding what you're aiming at. And aiming at having a good character is the highest aim, and it's the aim that will provide the most meaning in your life.
And of course, those relationships are becoming more and more disposable, and people are feeling used and abused, and they have trouble forming relationships in other areas of their life as a result. Media contributes to this, everything from pornography to The Bachelor to Disney films. I mean, I can't tell you how many women that I've gone on dates with where their belief really is that they're going to meet somebody and live happily ever after. And Dr. Peterson addresses this specifically. This is a fantasy. People want to see this because it is a fantasy. Just like somebody coming in with guns and killing 1,000 bad guys is a fantasy, but it's not reality. And prior to media influence, we would have as models the people that are within our community. We would see a couple married and how they work through their issues, how they deal with things. So they would see a realistic depiction. Now everything is a Hollywood ending. And just from my experience in the dating world, people have extremely unrealistic expectations of that they're going to meet a perfect soulmate and that's it, and that if it should be happily ever after. And that's not it. A relationship is an ongoing thing that you have to work and build on, and especially building your own character is vitally important. So, you know, we're really sold an untruth. And as somebody that's a father to a daughter, I feel that as she grows up and is entrenched in this media, there's not a lot of counterbalance, you know, with the erosion of the church, with the erosion of community, and now the erosion of the nuclear family. What are the influences on these children that, you know, you can meet somebody and learn how to communicate, learn how to listen properly, learn how to enter win-win negotiation, all the things that are necessary to interact with human beings in general. You know, the starting point of that is being able to have one relationship that works, you know, and with technologies and, you know, a breakdown of the family, you're just not getting those kind of quality relationships. And in terms of the statistics of fatherless homes, I have no choice really but to read these, because they're really important. They're really important to listen to, and I'm not going to remember them off the top of my head. So I'm going to read these to you, but I want you to think about this, because this is, well, let's say in the black communities in the US, 72% of children are born into fatherlessness. So when you think about that, or you think about fatherlessness increasing in society in all areas of life, I want you to think about these statistics and what it's going to mean not only for children, but for our society. 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. And by the way, these are from either U.S. Department of Health, this is from Census, this is from, you know, Center for Disease Control. They're all coming from legitimate government sources. So that didn't have an interest in what the outcome is. They're just, you know, doing this. And, you know, Dr. Peterson talks about that in psychology. One of the least part of psychology that people like is the statistical part, because of the truths that it tells. But I mean, unless you can deal with truth, you can't deal with reality. So these are the truths. So you have the majority of people committing suicide 5 times higher than average coming from fatherless homes. 90% of homeless and runaway children are from fatherless homes. Think about that, 90%. And then to say, well, the government should just come in and support single mothers and that's going to be the end of it and kids are going to grow up normal. No, actually the money is the least of the problem here. 85% of children who show, and by the way, that homelessness is 30 times the average, 32 times the average. 85% of children who show behavioral disorders come from fatherless homes, so 20 times the average. That's from the Center for Disease Control. 80% of rapists with anger problems come from fatherless homes, 14 times the average. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes, 9 times the average. Children with involved, loving fathers are significantly more likely to do well in school, have healthy self-esteem, exhibit empathy and pro-social behavior, and avoid high-risk behaviors such as drug use, truancy, criminal activity, to compare to children with uninvolved fathers. Okay, now couple this in your mind with low-status males and what's going to happen with that in the future. Studies on parent-child relationships and child well-being show that father's love is an important factor in predicting the social, emotional, and cognitive development and functioning of children and young adults. And there's even research, and you can see this in my War on Masculinity interview, that just by a man being there when a child is going through initial stages of development, there's an actual biological changes with a father being there versus not being there. It's very, very important. 24 million children, 34% live absent their biological father. This is in the US. And about 40% of children in father-absent homes have not seen their father at all in the past year. 26% of absent fathers live in a different state than the children, and 50% of children living absent their fathers have never set foot in their father's homes. This is in the US. Again, this is why I'm saying that this is a fight for civilization. You know, you can say we're going to punish men in court and make them pay child support and their deadbeat dads, but we're not dealing with the fact of what men mean in terms of the development of children and being part of the family. It's really, really important. Children who live absent their biological fathers are on average at least 2 to 3 times more likely to be poor, to use drugs, to experience educational, health, emotional, behavioral problems, and to be victims of child abuse, and to engage in criminal behavior than their peers who live with married or biological or adoptive parents. So even if they're not technically married, if the biological parents live together, the outcome is far, far better for those children. We have to stop this crazy idea that children can grow up with just single moms or broken homes and turn out the same. It's just not true. It's a fallacy. It's a lie that we want to tell ourselves, and we have to deal with this reality, or we're going to have a lot of, these are kids that are going to grow up and be antisocial in our society, that are going to rob people in the future, who are going to have criminality in the future. But most of all, you're punishing those children before they even have a chance, and they don't even understand. They didn't ask for this. Dr. Peterson Toxin in his personality lectures on how statistics is one of the least respected aspects of psychology because it tells the unbiased truth. We need to deal with the truth and what these facts are.
It's difficult to talk about this because people get offended, but the evidence strongly suggests that children in intact families do much better than children from single-parent families. And part of the reason for that is that it's not like single parents don't strive to do well for their children, but raising children is a very difficult job. It's very stressful and intense, and it's a two-person job to run a household and a family. I think women in our society have very difficult choices to make because it takes you often until you're into your 30s to establish a career and to make yourself somewhat financially independent. And of course, that's exactly the time when you're faced with the necessity of having children, if you're going to have them, and then balancing the requirement to work with the obligations of having a family is, of course, very, very difficult. And so I think
now, women are encouraged in our society to pursue careers, and that's great. But I think the problem is that it's been sold to them that you can do it all. And what happens is that I've met a lot of women, anecdotally, who are getting into their 30s and they haven't met a man. They may have a successful career, but now they're scrambling to meet men. And they haven't had a lot of relationships in the meantime to really know how to have a relationship. They're looking for the idealized fairy tale that we talked about. So they're out to lunch on that. Then the men that they do meet, they're either going to meet men that they don't want because they're low status, or they meet high status men who have no interest in getting a serious relationship. Those men may lie to them and say, yes, I'm going to get into a serious relationship, but just sleep with them and use them. And if they find a decent guy, they may not even know how to maintain a relationship because they haven't had maybe the proper father figures or enough chance to date or have relationships within their 20s because they were so focused on career, so they screw it up. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of women who are going to get old and either not have children, in which case what happens when their parents die, when their siblings and friends move away, they're going to be very alone and isolated. It's, as Dr. Peterson says, a sad, kind of existence and outcome to have that.
And so I think a lot of women find themselves in the trap that you described, is that they've been concentrating on building their career and their financial life, and then they try to rush the child and relationship part of it in their mid to late 30s, and it's pretty desperate. They get pretty desperate, and unsurprisingly, it's also the case that in our society now, marriage has become a luxury that's reserved for the rich. And I just can't see that as a good thing, because I believe that children need a model for both sexes, as well as the stability that having two parents provides. I mean, just to spell each other off is so important, and to support each other when you have children. It's much better for the children. And I think two people tend to be more reasonable than one person as well, because if one person is upset or stressed or hungover or desperate, the other person can step in to mediate and to calm them down and to keep an eye on them. And it's just a much more stable relationship. I mean, we used to have extended families, and of course they have their pros and their cons. And then, that was reduced to the nuclear family, and now we seem hell-bent to fragment that as well. And I believe that it's producing people who are very isolated and oriented towards the short term and distrustful of other people, because all they've encountered are relationships that fragment and don't work. So I think it's very dangerous.
And what we're seeing is this is increasing. We're getting increasingly isolated and distrusting people who themselves will have trouble forming relationships and have no model to look at. And if those people have children, those children will have no positive role models to look at, especially if they grow up in these single homes. As Dr. Peterson says, first we eliminated the extended family, and now we're doing a good job ripping apart the nuclear family. And I think for a number of reasons, that's a very, very horrific path to head down. Genetics is a real thing. Again, getting back to statistics, it might not be popular, but you have to deal with reality. Genetics is real. IQ is real. Okay, IQ is one of the number one predictors, if not the key predictor, in terms of correlation of outcome in life. So basically, if you're smart, you're going to have a good income, you're going to do well in life, and if you're not, you're going to have trouble. Dr. Peterson does this in great regard, talking about how the Army won't accept people with an IQ of 82 or less, and how, what is that saying even if the Army won't accept those people? There's a lot of people that have a lot of trouble functioning in our society from an IQ point of view, okay? And what happens is you have a welfare system that's coming in, and we address this in my interview, but they're supporting, essentially promoting behavior that is irrational behavior, that is short-term thinking behavior, that is low impulse control behavior and short-term gratification behavior. And people are going out and just having children, not thinking about the consequences, and the government's coming in and said, hey, no problem, we'll support those children, we'll help you out, and anytime you incentivize something, you're going to get more of it. So the more that you incentivize this behavior, the more that you're going to have the poor people. And a lot of the intelligent people look at our society and say, we don't want to have a lot of kids, or we don't want to bring kids up in this world. So intelligent people are having less and less children. Wealthy people are having less and less children. And the people that are having the most children are the poor, the uneducated, and the low IQ. And since genetics are real, and yes, there's deviations from the norm, there's all of this stuff, but over time, the lower IQ, having low IQ children, on top of the fact that you have broken, fragmented families and all the behaviors from that, you're going to have a dysgenics effect, which is the dumbing down of society. You know, there's a great Mike Judge movie who did like Beavis and Butthead and stuff. I forget the name of it, but anyway, it deals with this and what happens if, we continue to kind of de-evolve. So you have both that genetics component as well as the actual component of our society degrading and having less fulfilling relationships and more sociopathy and antisocial behavior as a result of broken homes. So both of those are going to converge, and it's going to be a real negative place unless we make some serious changes.
That's part of a misguided drive towards equality, where every family structure is accorded the same respect as every other one, even though I think that that's very, very misguided. I think it entices people down a very troublesome road. It's very hard to be a single parent. It isn't something that should be aimed at, because the responsibility is overwhelming. I mean, a child or two young children essentially constitute a full-time job. And to try to do that and to have a full-time job means that you have no life outside of your work and your children. And it's very burdensome and stressful. And I can't see it working as an ideal. Now, we haven't figured out exactly how to reconcile women taking an active role in the workplace with women as mothers. It's a very difficult thing to sort out. But it seems to me that deciding that every family is the same in terms of desirability is not an appropriate solution.
Dr. Peterson points out that largely social experiments do not work. This idea of taking money from the rich, giving it to the poor and redistributing it, it has unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences is you're reinforcing irresponsibility.
How many men are in the men going their own way movement? I've encountered it online a fair bit, and I know that people's fears of the family courts can be well-founded. I mean, it seems to me that the family courts are tilted very badly in a punitive direction with regards to men, and I do think it's had the consequence that you describe. I mean, obviously, it's necessary for men to take responsibility for children that they have fathered, but many men do seem to end up with the worst of both worlds. They have a tremendous financial burden, and they have almost no access to their children. And then their children are often turned against them in one way or another by vindictive mothers. That doesn't always happen, obviously, but it happens fairly regularly.
Men are increasingly opting out of fatherhood and marriage. Another statistic out there is 70% of divorces are initiated by women, and 80% of legal custody and family court claims are filed by women. So in other words, not only is a man going to get screwed, for lack of a better word, if he gets married and has to go to family court, most of the time it's the women that break up the family and end the relationship. And I believe the reason for that is they're incentivized. Again, the government, by their regulations, are saying if this marriage dissolves, we're going to support women, we're going to get behind women. So women are thinking, well, things aren't working out too well in this relationship. This fantasy of, happily ever after isn't happening the way I thought it would. I'm out of here and I'm going to get rewarded as a result of that. So you've got, as a man, growing movement of people that are like, you know what, this is a real bad bet. I'm going to 70% chance that my wife is going to leave me and she's going to get custody of the children. I'm going to, lose out financially, especially if that man is high status. Hey, why not play the field? Why even engage in this?
Clients who've been really ruined by the custody process, men who wanted to have their children, 50% of the time, whose lives were basically destroyed by their attempts to reach that sort of agreement. So, yeah, and I mean, who knows what the long-term consequences are, but I have no figures on the men going their own way movement. I have no idea how popular that is, but it's certainly something that you can see popping up everywhere on the net, and it is definitely fueled by men's fear that they'll get tangled into a relationship and lose the relationship, but maintain all the financial commitments that are part and parcel of it. And that really is the worst of both worlds.
As people age, it will become harder and harder to find long-term relationships. And people are no longer thinking about the long term. They're thinking about the short-term gratification, which Dr. Peterson addresses in our interview. And when you're not thinking about the long term and you're not planning ahead, when that future does come, you're not prepared for it. You're going to be in a very isolated situation.
I don't think that it's very much fun to go through life alone. It's very isolated and cold. And another thing that we really haven't considered is, what are people going to do when they're old? Because I can't imagine a fate in some sense that's worse than being old and completely isolated. And, you know, your friends fall away as you get older. Not always, but family bonds are the ones that generally really last. And if you haven't established a credible relationship in your life and sort of populated your life with children, then it's beyond me what's going to sustain you when you get old.
Again, women are only attracted to men of equal status or higher status because of their biological impulses. And this whole thing where we're having more and more women, you know, graduating university than men, this has never happened. And I'm not saying that women shouldn't be able to pursue careers or have equal opportunity. They absolutely should. But we have to look at what's going to happen, because women, by and large, are women. And what I mean by that is women want a man who is as successful as them or more successful than them. It's just a biological drive. You know, don't kill the messenger. I'm just reporting what the studies show. And there's less and less men that fit that.
What will happen is there'll be increased competition among women for the few men who have high status, and those high status men will have so many opportunities with women that their necessity to commit to any long-term relationship will be markedly attenuated. And then the men who are less successful, they'll have to content themselves with pornography or other distractions. That's how it looks to me. And I think there's some data on this at the colleges where there are more women than men. You'd think that all the men would have a lot of opportunities, but that doesn't seem to be what happens. What seems to happen is that the ever shrinking number of relatively high status male students have tremendous sexual opportunities on campuses like that, and the more ordinary men still have very few. So I think it'll be a matter of women increasingly chasing something that's in short supply. And I guess the other consequence of that will be that there'll be more and more push for government support for childcare and for non-standard familial arrangements. And I think we're already seeing that. You know, women will try to turn to arrangements other than those with a man in order to provide a secure base for their children. But generally speaking, radical social experiments fail. And so I don't see switching the structure of the family to something radically different. That'll produce all sorts of the unintended consequences that you already described.
Now, the more that there's an income disparity as well, the more that we see violence. You know, I'm by no means a communist, but clearly if you have a huge divide, you're going to have a society of people that are going to feel disenfranchised, and they're going to want to act out against the people that are successful. And that includes people that are successful in terms of the high status males. And they'll be open to any opportunity to increase their status, as Dr. Peterson states. So I believe that it's not gun control that it's an issue. I don't believe it's rap music or this or that is causing these mass shootings, that's causing, by and large, the radicalization of people. I believe a lot of what's causing all of these things is that people feel disenfranchised. They feel that they're not listened to. They feel like women aren't attracted to them, and they feel that they have nothing to lose. And as Dr. Peterson says, it becomes a romantic notion. And also, they would rather live in infamy than just disappear and never be noticed. And I think that there's a lot of people growing up that feel unnoticed. And if, fame is becoming a big part of our culture with Instagram and all of these other social things. And if people can do something, even if it kills them, and their name is in the paper, to some people it's worth it to do that. And unfortunately, that's a reality that we have to face as a result of this.
Definitely. I mean, there's lots of evidence on that. Well, like you said, low status men have very little to lose. And so they're often attracted to any endeavor that will offer them the opportunity to increase their status. I mean, there was a very interesting sociological analysis of drug sales gangs in the US a while back. A student at a university, I think it was at the University of Chicago, happened to make contact with a drug dealing gang and infiltrated it. They knew who he was, but he got to be quite friendly with all the members of the gang, including the leader. And the gang disbanded because the housing project that they were centered in was torn down. And when the gang disbanded, the leader turned the books over to the student investigator. And what they found was that the typical street drug dealer was making less than minimum wage. But the reason that they were doing it was because there was some chance of moving up the hierarchy, because it's a pretty violent game. And of course, the leadership is changing all the time because people get killed. And so they kind of regarded it as a lottery ticket. You had to put in your time at the bottom, but there was some chance that you'd end up being one of the big guys. And that was worth it. They also found that most of the drug dealers also had other jobs. So they tended to be more industrious than the typical person, perhaps. But yeah, the drive for status and achievement in men is very strong. And if it isn't given an outlet, then it looks for one. Certainly, radicalization is one option under those circumstances. It's a call to adventure. I mean, I think that's why groups like ISIS are able to attract support from all over the world, is that they offer disenfranchised young men the opportunity to go do something that looks heroic. It's an adventure. I mean, it's obviously a misguided adventure and a misbegotten notion, but if there's no valid form of status striving provided in your society, then you're going to do whatever's necessary to find it somewhere else. That's exactly what's happening. They pick infamy over non-entity. They'd rather be famous for being terrible than not to be noticed at all. And a lot of that's driven by horrible resentment, years of resentment and fantasizing about the fame that will go along with an act like that.
And this one's hard for me because I was raised Catholic and became agnostic. But, as I listened to Dr. Peterson, starting with Joe Rogan's show, but also all of his lectures, I understand what he's saying about religion is somehow integrated into our DNA, and how that the messages are at least either the mythologies of those are either ring true because they speak to who we are as people and it's been a philosophy that's passed down, or there's actually some kind of metaphysical way that interacts with us, that there is some kind of spirituality that's encoded in our DNA. Whatever it is, it's beyond my understanding, but I'm leaning more to believing that there is some kind of spiritual component that is part of our DNA and who we are as people, and that we're just unable to really fully understand it. And irregardless of that, there's a lot of truths, there's a lot of philosophy. Even if you just want to think of Christianity as a philosophy, there was no real written word for a long time. So in order for people to tell kind of moral stories, they had to tell them as, they had to tell them as stories, and they had to tell them in stories that people could understand on a mass level, and they had to combine things because, in order to tell a story amongst time, it had to kind of consolidate a lot of ideas. So I believe that you can't take the Bible or other fairy tales or other things and look at them from a purely logical point of view. I think that you have to understand them as stories that have been passed down to inform us as human beings, and that there's a lot of human knowledge that's been passed down through generation and generation that went into these stories and added on to it and improved upon it as time went on. And that with the throwing out of religion, we've thrown out a lot of these teachings and understandings, and I think that's a huge mistake, because there's a lot to be learned from these stories. So I think that we have to return to an understanding that that there is certain mythologies, and that those mythologies have some importance to them in terms of how we should live our life and the guidance. And I think that what happened in communist Russia and China and these places is when you take all aspects of religion and all aspects of community out of the situation, then what happens is that it's filled with something much worse, and a very chaotic concept. And I think that's upon us right now. And so I encourage people, even if you're not religious, to respect the traditions of religion and to understand that there's wisdom there about keeping the family together and a lot of other messages, and in terms of character and how we should be from a moral point of view. And that wisdom, it's a big mistake to just have a nihilistic outlook and just say, well, nothing matters, and live chaotically, because that's going to lead to ruin, essentially. So and I'm going to include at the end of this a clip from Dr. Peterson where he directly states this, because he says it far better than I could ever hope to say it. And I think it's a great way to end this presentation. But essentially, one of the things that he's saying is that when there's a hole, when you pull religion out of it, something has to come in and fill it, and we're seeing that now. So I don't want this to be like a hopeless thing. I mean, I think that this is a fight for civilization. I believe there's a lot of really serious things going on in our society, and I believe that if we don't deal with it now, that it's going to be exacerbated. However, I do think there's things that we can do to fix it. Whether we do that or not, I don't know. I hope that we can. But it's at least worth pursuing, attempting to spread the message and hoping that you can reach people and that people will want to do something about it. So I wrote down 4 things that I think are key that we have to do to try and avoid the outcomes that are described in this video. First one is a return to the understanding of the importance and lessons of religion, community, and the lessons of old in terms of guidance of how to live our life. Second, a return to the nuclear family structure and keeping families intact. Third, we have to fundamentally change our court system so that men are not pushed out of children's lives. 4, individuals need to work on themselves and build their own character. And that is where the self-authoring program comes in. But even if you're not going to do the self-authoring program, in the very least, what you can do, even if you can't affect change within our society, is you can work on yourself and become a better person yourself. And that certainly is a virtuous thing to do. And I encourage you to do that. So I think those 4 things are kind of the key to unwinding what's going on. So I hope that you find this presentation meaningful. I'm not doing this for financial gain. I'm not doing it for anything. I'm doing this because I want to, it's something that's important to me and the future of our society. And I have a daughter, and I hope that I leave this world in a better place than when I came into it. And I think that's I think that's a hard thing to do, but I feel compelled to do my part. So if you enjoy this video or see some value in it that would be, help others or help our society, I ask that you share it. And, other than that, at least listen to what I'm saying, keep an open mind, and try to inform yourself. And, if you disagree, fine. But, I'm pretty certain that there's at least some things that I'm saying that are pretty hard to dispute and that certainly need to be addressed, or we're going to have some serious problems. So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen, and I appreciate it. And I'm going to leave with Dr. Peterson's words. And thank you again. Take care.
You could think about it as the beginnings of a state religion. And the problem is that there's a hole in people's souls that religious structures fill. And if the structures themselves are destroyed, then other things flow in to fill that hole. And they're often ideas that are much crazier than the original ideas. So, and then things destabilize very badly. And it seems to me that that's certainly happening in our culture. I mean, the Russian thinkers like Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky, they were very careful analysts of the proclivity towards ideological chaos. Excuse me. The proclivity towards ideological chaos in a society. And they both believed that a return to the old forms was necessary. Solzhenitsyn felt that that was the only antidote to the kind of socialist horrors of the Soviet Union, that the culture had to return to its previous path of development. I mean, it's hard for people to sort that out. It's very difficult for people to sort that out. I mean, I think that in Christianity, you have this idea of God the Father. And the idea there is that there's a central figure who's like the spirit of culture that sets out the ordering principles. And those are fatherly principles. And then you have the idea of the Son, and the Son is the person who speaks the truth fundamentally. That's the Savior from a Christian perspective. And even if you don't admit that those entities have a kind of a metaphysical existence, there are certainly principles that need to be respected. There is such a thing as the spirit of the culture, the ordering principles of the culture. There better be, because otherwise everything is just chaos. And the idea that the spoken truth is redemptive, which I think is the central idea of Christianity, I think that that's as indisputable an existential guideline as you're ever likely to find. I mean, honest communication is the prerequisite for trust, and trust is the prerequisite for social order. So if people aren't speaking honestly and attempting to maintain order, then everything falls apart. And that wouldn't be good if everything fell apart.